Well, welcome all. The clock has formally struck 1, and we are thrilled to have you here for our conversation from tragedy to apocalypse in American literature, a book discussion with our very own Lin Atnip. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago, and I'll welcome you to our campus on this very chilly day. It is 0 in our world, but it is warm in our virtual world as we engage in the liberal arts. So hopefully this is keeping you all out of harm's way today if you're in the area or the many other places that are freezing at this moment across our country. The Graham School, for those of you who are not familiar, is 130 years young in our mission that is trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning. And a hallmark is our basic program, which is about to celebrate its 80th anniversary, where people read great books across all of the different forms of literature and philosophy and social thought. And Lin Atnip is an instructor in that program and will be bringing you a view into the many different ideas that really make up that program in the form of a really powerful book that looks at literature. We have many other upcoming events for those who want to continue their learning with us through this format. We have a book discussion coming up later this month on longevity hubs, which are regional experiments to bring in an ecosystem that's really devoted to long life and learning. We have a session on our program, Dimensions of Diversity. And then we have a really interesting discussion coming up with the head of the University of Chicago Health System, Tom Jakowitz, who's going to talk about how healthcare is changing for a long life world. I'll also just mention that registration is now open for spring courses. There are already some that have entirely filled and have long waiting lists. So I'll just encourage you, Marina will put in the chat the registration link to register now, especially if you think your courses may be without spots soon. All right, the reason that you are all here, and I'm going to take down my screen and I'm going to highlight our discussant. Here we go. Perfect. Hello, Lin. How are you? Nice to see you. Welcome. Lin Atnip is a tutor at St. John's College in Santa Fe and an instructor in the basic program. She completed her PhD in 2019 in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and then completed a postdoctorate in the Center for Humanities and Social Change at the University of California, Santa Barbara, focusing on the question of how we are educated to the conditions of modernity, especially modern crisis, through reading and reflecting on literature. Very fitting, given what her book is about. Her first book was recently published by Lexington Books. She also writes fiction and poetry, and she joined the basic program in 2015. Welcome, Lin. And let me turn it over to you. What we're going to do in this book discussion, Lin's going to give introductory remarks. I'm then going to ask a series of questions, and then we're going to come to all of your questions. So if you have them throughout, please put them into the chat and we'll get to them at the Q&A period. And with that, Lin, let me turn it over to you and I'll sit back with my fellow virtual learners here and we'll hear your introduction to your book.
Thank you, Seth. It is a delight to be here, wherever here is, anyway, with all of you in this virtual space. And I'm very glad for the chance to share this work beyond the bounds of Chicago. It's a pleasure and a privilege to talk about apocalypse with you from the Graham School, with you, my friends or future friends, to the extent that there is a future. This book came in part out of my teaching in the basic program, not only because it was in these classrooms that I read and discussed and deepened my understanding of these particular texts, but because those experiences provided an empirical basis for the claims that the book makes about how we're educated by reading and reflecting on literature, an activity that is significantly aided by and may not really be possible without other readers to challenge our readings, which too often just confirm us in our own beliefs. So that is to say, it was here or in basic program classes and spaces and with you that I've learned so much of what I've learned about these things and what I've learned about learning. One of those classes, which I think some of you probably were in, was on Norman Maclean. including his book, Young Men and Fire. That book was the initiating spark, so to speak, for my dissertation, which was the basis for the book. So by way of introduction, I'm going to say a few words about McLean. Young Men and Fire, on those of you on whom I have not yet foisted it or have not otherwise encountered it, is a nonfiction account of a 1949 forest fire in Man Gulch, Montana, which killed 12 smoke jumpers and a Forest Service ranger sent to fight it. It's also the story of McLean's investigation decades later into the fire, the aftermath of which he had seen as a young man and which continued to haunt him. When I was working on my doctorate in the Committee on Social Thought and preparing a dissertation proposal, I took a road trip to the West Coast with the Thomas Elders, and we listened to the audiobook, movingly read by McLean's son, John, to accompany the hours and hours of sublimely sparse Montana landscape. We actually did this twice, driving out to a McLean festival the following year in his hometown of Seeley Lake with the then University of Chicago wrestling coach, a friend of ours who had coincidentally won the Norman McLean Teaching Award, but that's another story. I do have some pictures to go with it, and I'll just say that our motley crew fit in well among the fly fishers, firefighters, and literary types that the festival attracted. So just to provide a little bit of visual evidence for this. This is us at Man Gulch, Montana, back in 2015 or so, and the guy in the hat is the wrestling coach. These are the crosses that mark the graves, marks the spot where each of the firefighters' bodies was found. I'll just leave this up for a minute because I have a quote I'm shortly going to share. Listening to this book, I was arrested by McLean's various stated intent to transform catastrophe into tragedy, and I think it's worth reading one of his suggestive formulations. Although young men died like squirrels in Man Gulch, the Man Gulch fire should not end there, smoke drifting away and leaving terror without consolation of explanation and controversy without lasting settlement. Probably most catastrophes end this way, without an ending, the dead not even knowing how they died. This is a catastrophe that we hope will not end where it began. It might go on and become a story. It will not have to be made up. That is all important to us. But we do have to know in what odd places to look for missing parts of a story about a wildfire, and of course have to know a story and a wildfire when we see one. So this story is a test of its own belief, that in this cockeyed world there are shapes and designs, if only we have some curiosity, training, and compassion, and take care not to lie or be sentimental. It would be a start to the story if this catastrophe were found to have circled around out there somewhere until it could return to itself with explanations of its own mysteries and with the grief it left behind, not removed because grief has its own place at or near the end of things, but altered somewhat by the addition of something like wonder. Wonder, for example, because we can now say that the fire whirl which destroyed was caused by 3 winds on a river. If we could say something like this and be speaking both accurately and somewhat like Shelley when he spoke of clouds and winds, then what we would be talking about would start to change from catastrophe without a filled-in story to what could be called the story of a tragedy. But tragedy would only be part of it, as it is of life. Or in a briefer formulation, there are also missing parts to the story of the lonely crosses ahead of us. What if we should find enough of them to see catastrophe change into the shape of remembered tragedy? The basic question that resulted in my book then was, what does it mean to transform catastrophe into tragedy? McLean, as many of you may know, was for his entire career an English professor at the University of Chicago, spanning the heyday of Neo-Aristotelianism, so Aristotle's idea of story, or plot, mythos, and of tragedy, as laid out in the Poetics, are implicit and sometimes explicit in McLean's conception of his task. To transform catastrophe into tragedy, I gathered both from what McLean says and what he himself does in Young Men and Fire, means to take a terrible, heartbreaking, and seemingly senseless event or events and to give it a form, an artistic form that allows us somehow to make sense of it. This led to the question, what does it mean to make sense? And how does literature generally allow us to make sense of our experience? For MacLean, a basic part of the task of making sense was a matter of filling in the missing pieces, being able to trace the chain of causality that led to the men's deaths. 3 of the smoke jumpers had survived the Man Gulch fire, one of them, Foreman Wag Dodge, by lying down in the ashes of an escape fire he lit to burn away the grass around him, creating a lee around which the main fire would burn. Dodge tried to get the other men to lie down alongside him, but they did not understand or trust him, or just panicked and kept running and were eventually caught by the flames. The father of one of the victims alleged that it was actually Dodge's fire that spread and burned the other smoke jumpers, and MacLean wanted to reach a belated verdict, ideally to exonerate Dodge, but in any case to offer at least the consolation of explanation. But the work is clearly not just about settling the facts. First, it tells the story not only of the events of Man Gulch, but of MacLean's investigation. And the work is permeated with MacLean's reflections on nearing the end of his life. So it's the story of an old man as well as young men, an old man coming to terms with his own aging, the deaths of those he has lost, and his own lives not lived. And it's not just dual, but multiple tragedy and mystery story, history and memoir. It contains scientific graphs and 19th century poetry, geological history, and comic anecdote. This multidimensionality is at times bemusing, but it certainly contributes to the book's distinctiveness and arguably to its power. And it seems intrinsic to the book's form and its endeavor, whether or not it's fully successful. The work has the feeling of groping towards something that can't be cleanly or directly expressed. This provoked a further question, which is, why does MacLean have to make sense in this way, which seems particularly modern, certainly not a classic Aristotelian tragedy? In the book, I argue more broadly, MacLean's effort to transform catastrophe into tragedy is best understood as an attempt to make sense of the disastrous events according to a different and in some way higher order of meaning than common sense, and to represent those events such that this sense is manifest. This amounts not just to explaining why things went terribly wrong, but also seeing in the catastrophe an intimation of certain hidden or unacknowledged conditions of human life, not only material, but ideal, as we might say. So the meaning of the events is not merely to be found horizontally, so to speak, in their outcomes, good or bad, but vertically as manifestations of a background order that includes both heroism and enormity, one might say a mythical order. In other words, the events of Man Gulch seem at once to radically disrupt the everyday order according to which we make sense of things, and to indicate the possibility, indeed the necessity, of a different ground of sense. What makes fire tragic literature, then, is that it represents this disruption in a way that implies this different, a more comprehensive kind of sense, which sees human life as subject to hostile forces and conditions that can never be finally and fully comprehended, but still affirms some normatively structured order. What makes it modern tragic literature is its recognition that the sense one finds can't be other than fraught, tenuous, provisional, and perhaps radically threatened if the work finally moves beyond the tragic to what I call the apocalyptic. So at one level, Young Men in Fire portrays the young man as classical tragic heroes who, through their youthful bravery, have crossed some line of nature and brought down its terrible and disproportionate nemesis upon them. But in the final pages, this kind of sense-making seems threatened. Indeed, any kind of sense-making at all seems threatened as MacLean starts using wild and shifting metaphors, suggesting the impossibility of pinning down what the fire is or what it means. And he associates it to the atomic bomb and the prospect of human extinction, the destruction of the source of all sense. For you Hyde Parkers, he brings in Henry Moore's sculpture outside the Regenstein, which I will show. He He writes of Moore's sculpture. The atomic mushroom has become for our age the outer symbol of the inner fear of the explosive power of the universe. It is the symbol of a whole age, and it took an artist to express the meaning the mushroom has for us. Henry Moore's bronze atomic mushroom, with its hollow eyes, is intentionally bivisual, and from every point of view. Wherever you stand, the bronze looks like both an atomic mushroom and a skull, and is meant to. While traditional tragedies are, well, tragic, they still affirm some value-laden objective order of things that persists beyond the downfall of the tragic hero. The conclusion of Young Men and Fire made me think that our modern situation, maybe particularly post-1945, calls into question that objective order and poses an unprecedented challenge to sense-making that makes traditional tragedy impossible and calls for a new literary form or forms. The rest of the book looks at more directly at works which take on this apocalyptic threat, the prospect that human beings are undermining the conditions of their own existence, our own existence, both materially and spiritually. Without wanting to spoil the ending of the book, I'll say that I don't find some comprehensive new framework of sense that will allow us to avert or ameliorate humanity's catastrophic tendencies, or even necessarily console us for them. But I do find that, even in their darkness, the texts I read, and I think great literature generally, suggest and orient us towards some source of light and understanding that transcends the social conventions and distortions that are responsible for our various plights. Literature, perhaps self-promotingly, itself presents an implicit argument for the need of an ongoing practice of reading to bring us to awareness of that alternative ground of sense and keep reorienting us to that light. And if you hear a little bit of Plato and the allegory of the cave in what I say, you're not wrong. The upside to Apocalypse is at least you've got good justification to keep taking basic program classes and reading great books. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was a beautiful opening, very compelling in your ability to really bring us into the book and its contents, and also to connect it to why many people are in this room, which is that they've been part of the basic program and they've seen the real value of these conversations in their lives. And I want to start on that note where you ended your talk and your observation that imaginative literature helps us to reflect on life and on society and to make more sense of both of them. And so in your book, I want to quote this. You outline a theory of reading which directs us to realities and imperatives that are ignored, denied, or distorted by dominant social convention and habits of cognition. Can you talk a little bit more about that theory and how literature can be a vehicle for our reflection?
Sure. So the dissertation had a subtitle which was toward an epistemological theory and practice of reading. The fact that I can hardly say that may be an indication of why I thought maybe in publishing the book for a wider audience, I should, you know, if not downplay that, at least try to express it in a little less scholarly terms. But it contained a more fleshed out version of this theory, which I developed with, not to say stole from, my fellow basic program instructor, Charles Thomas Elder. We've co-written an article that someday, when I get through the tedium of reformatting it, we'll try to publish somewhere. But the basic idea of this is that our default way of making sense of our experience is social functional, which is to say what common sense takes to be good is not necessarily good in some transcendent or objective sense, but what is good for the maintenance of social institutions and hierarchies, at least in the short term. But we all have a tacit sense of some true or at least truer good, and more generally, a ground of judgment. And in our paper, and to some degree in the book, Elder and I argue that what makes great literature great is that it references this other ground of judgment. This is that I don't know, that thing that one feels that distinguishes a great book from, just something that is a fun beach read, that kind of weight to it. And so in reading and trying to interpret these books both on our own and together, we come to some greater consciousness of that alternate ground. And I think importantly are just oriented to the fact of its existence.
Well, so you bring this theory to life by examining the works of Robert Lowell, Wallace Stevens, Cormac McCarthy, and Norman Maclean, and you talked in your opening about Maclean. I'd love to investigate some of the others on the table, and maybe I'll follow your lead on which order to go in, but I'd love to look at the other authors here and get a sense of how they bring this theory to life.
Sure. So with McLean, the the sort of catastrophic force that he's confronting is a force of nature, and that and with the other authors, with particularly McCarthy and Lowell, I move into authors that are confronting the sort of human forces of destruction. McCarthy, I focus on Blood Meridian, which I think some of you have also read with me, or with the Thomas Elders, which I referred into in the book as the apotheosis of the apocalyptic. It's this uncompromisingly bleak picture of humanity about a historical gang of scalp hunters in the 19th century. The protagonist is a kid described as having a mindless taste for violence, and the book conveys in various ways that humanity is likely headed towards its own self-destruction. Um, at the same time, the language is stunningly beautiful. The McCarthy includes these descriptions of the sublime southwestern landscape, and so the question is, what am I as a reader to take from this? Some critics have called it nihilistic, others call it moral, and neither of those seem right to me. Maybe just to back up a little and state generally that in each case, in each book that I looked at, and I think this is sort of the application of the theory, such as it is generally, I tried to attend to the problem that that particular text presented on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the further reality or the ground of sense that it seemed to suggest. Um, with Blood Meridian, and I think for efficiency, I'll just say that Lowell, in his poem Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, presents a similar tension where he depicts this gruesome violence we see meant to deplore, using 19th century whaling with particular reference to Moby Dick as a stand in for the carnage of World War II. But on the other hand, the figure in his poem of Ahab and the sonic power of the poetry are so compelling, aesthetically, and also as an image of something very intense. Um, so I argued that Blood Meridian and then Lowell's poem in a different medium or form shows the limitations of enlightened self-interest or conventional goodness as standards to make sense of the world and humanity's destiny, at the very least because they might be finally impotent against the darker and destructive aspects of our humanity, and maybe even because we wouldn't want entirely to quell those aspects. And neither text finally resolves this tension or shows us how we can finally resolve it, but they suggest a different perspective that encompasses these conflicting strands, and they help us to inhabit that perspective. Um, and so then finally, I have Wallace Stevens, in which I look at both his poetics, his prose about poetry, and particularly the poem Auroras of Autumn and some of his other poetry. And there I focus on the other sense of apocalypse. As some of you may know, apocalypse sort of more original meaning is unveiling. Um, his poetry is explicitly concerned with the lack of a shared supreme fiction, as he calls it in modernity, some collective sense of who we are and what we have to do. And his poems are both about the search for that supreme fiction, and they are that search. They give us different images for sources of meaning in the world, like the auroras of autumn. And these images are of something sublime, but also well, that image is of something sublime, but also inhuman and possibly threatening. He has a very wide array of different ways of conceiving how we relate to the world. And along those lines, his poetry recognizes that the modern poet can't just give us a new myth. The search for how to understand ourselves is this ongoing sort of collaborative process between the reader and the poem or novel or artwork. Um,
Well, so, I mean, you've given us a really clear grasp of how you see this theory applying across four really different authors and writings about different topics. And you mentioned, Lynn, in your introductory remarks that you see this theory really reinforcing why it's so valuable to be a part of the basic program, both as an instructor as well, potentially as a student. And maybe not surprisingly, as a dean, I agree with you. But I'm curious if you could say a bit more about how, if at all, researching and writing this book has shaped the way you think about that value, and maybe even shaped the way that you then approach teaching and instructing in the basic program itself.
sure. Yeah, it's a kind of when I've thought about this connection, there's a sort of chicken or egg quality to it because on the one hand, I think that my whole sense of what literature does and how it does it comes out of my teaching in the basic program and this sense of this emergent understanding that comes out through their shared discussion and attention to a text. But on the other hand, I do think, and I hope this is sort of along the lines of making tacit knowledge explicit, that bringing this to greater consciousness has at least made me a little bit more deliberate in certain aspects of my teaching. And I, in some ways, hesitate to say this because I want people to feel like they're getting their money's worth. But I really feel like I shouldn't be telling people or teaching, what my thought or opinion is about what a book means, certainly not in an authoritative way, because really the most transformational education happens through each of us, the students and the instructors, bringing to consciousness our own tacit sense of what we find in the text, and of course, like hearing other people's interpretations is an integral part of that process. But I feel like my work has made me inclined to be a little quieter in the classroom and just sort of create the space to elicit those self-reflective thoughts and moments.
Well, I have more questions, but I want to start getting to some of the questions in the chat. And so I'll start with Jay Trembley's. You mentioned the distinction of nature versus human causes in the writers that you analyzed. How would you tentatively apply this distinction to the recent fires in Southern California, particularly in light of Didion's frequently cited writings of late? Or should we consider West Day of the Locust?
Um, Thank you. Yes, I confess don't. I'm not familiar enough to speak to the Didion, but certainly I've thought about the fires in conjunction with my sense of apocalypse, and particularly with the article, the author of which escapes me, was something like "Fire season will never end" a couple years ago. And it seems to me that the idea of the Anthropocene, which is maybe in the background, if not much explicitly addressed in this book, and this idea that we live in an age in which human beings have become a geological force in a sense. Certainly, we have had an impact on the natural forces, brings these things together. Nature is still can still be a force apart from us, but we have the power, which is one of those sort of terrible, sublime, both awful and awesome things, to actually affect nature. And the result seems more recently to be potentially quite catastrophic.
There's an interesting chat between two members of our community here, between Jerry and Anna, about the word apocalypse, which I think most of us think immediately of destruction, but also means an uncovering or a revelation. And I think you're referencing in some ways both meanings along the way. There's an interesting question, though, originally on that destructive meaning about whether there's room for comedy, capital C here, instigation for action, using characters to make an educated audience laugh. Just talk a little bit about kind of how we see that idea coming in the context maybe of the destructive meaning of apocalypse, and just how you see that interplay in literature of, this terrible outcome, but yet finding joy in life anyway. Because I think that is a core idea embedded in many texts across time and space is you're going to die, and yet
Yeah.
you still are living and have the capacity for joy. And how do you reconcile those realities, and how does literature and the reflection on it in your theory help you to potentially get there?
Yeah, thanks. I have, for some reason, much more difficulty thinking about comedy than tragedy, but I have somewhat, and I think it's important to think about as well. Um, a couple thoughts. First of all, interestingly, Stevens has been referred to as like a comic poet, in the sense that there's always this final affirmation of um, I don't know, of the delightful in life, apart from and against whatever doubts one has about the meaningfulness of things, or our fate, both individual and collective. In the book, I think I actually sort of criticized or critiqued that comic sensibility as a kind of evasion of something, but I do think that one where one ends up with this apocalyptic sensibility has, by some necessity, maybe to be a kind of double consciousness, where on the one hand you recognize um, the potentially, maybe probably disastrous trajectory that we're on, and on the other hand, that doesn't negate the sort of I think of Iris Murdoch saying one has to be good for nothing. The sort of necessity of still being human and good and moral, and taking certain joys and delights and appreciations moment by moment. Um, I also think one can kind of have a blackly humorous sensibility about it, and kind of laugh at the absurdity of what human beings are doing, but that's a different sense of different sense of comedy.
Lynn, you're now a published author, which is quite an exciting outcome. Can I just ask you to talk a little bit about what it's like to contribute knowledge in this way, and how you feel about this moment in your own, kind of growth and learning, and how it even shapes what's next for you?
Sure. I hope that I'm contributing to knowledge. Well, I mean, I really appreciate this kind of event, because in the wider academy, um, you can get a don't want to say it's easy to get a book published, but it's easier to get a book published than it is to actually know that it will insert itself into the ongoing discussion and discourse of these topics. And I hope that my book will have some impact on the sort of scholarly and academic understanding of the apocalyptic in literature. But it is really meaningful to me to be able to bring bring these thoughts into this community. And I intentionally tried to write the book so that it would be at least somewhat accessible to a general and generalist, non-specialist audience, because I think these topics are or ought to be of general human concern. And so it's very meaningful to me to be able to talk with people who are outside the academy, or outside sort of scholarly realm about that. As far as future publishing, I confess that primarily at work on a novel right now, which is sort of also coming at the apocalyptic theme, but from a different angle and a very different mode. So I'm not sure if there's a next scholarly book project, but I wouldn't discount it. I just sort of have to tackle the problems as they seem to come to me.
Well, I think if you're an author on the apocalypse, you kind of need things to go bad in the world, just my guess, because I feel like Camus' The Plague, it really hit its like popularity mark during the early part of the pandemic. So, who knows? But maybe if something really gives people a sense of apocalypse, they're going to say, th this becomes quite popular reading. Just a little humor there. I was trying to get to the comedy idea that I guess was brought up
Yeah.
earlier in the chat.
I
I don't
There have
actually
been
have.
moments when I've caught myself thinking, "Oh, good, things are so bad right now. Like it's good for my career in one way or another." But I really try to avoid it.
Hold
Thankfully,
down.
it seems like, whatever I want to happen is not going to have much impact on things one way or another. I pray for world peace.
Yes, I do too. To be clear, I'm not actually rooting for apocalypse, just for your book sales. So John has a more serious comment here. I think of tragedy as consisting of ongoing events, a pattern that occurs over and over again in human history. In some sense, it's an inescapable human condition. But apocalypse, it seems, contains the potential for revolutionary change, a revelation that takes us to a new place. Maybe it's a better place, maybe not. Do the readings that you examine correlate at all with my interpretation of the terms?
Yes, thank you. That seems very well put. And I do think that this shift I see in McLean from his attempting to interpret what happened at Man Gulch in a kind of classical tragic way to this slide toward apocalypse at the end um, indicates that shift. That uh, I think about it partly just when you have the prospect as emerged with the atomic bomb and what came to light after those weapons came into being of, wiping out human civilization or possibly the human species, that prospect undermines some sense of continuity that really radically challenges um, how you make sense of things, whereas previous tragedy is, more local, more limited, and the kind of the world goes on and can be affirmed despite the more local catastrophe. I wanted to take this opportunity maybe to briefly respond to this earlier conversation between Jerry and Anna about the relation between revelation and catastrophe in the word apocalypse, um, which I thought, and I discuss a little in the book, they seem very closely related. That the catastrophe itself is a kind of revelation. I think that when things, and I think we saw and felt this in globally with the pandemic, that not only the disease itself, but all the social effects that it had sort of brought to light all of these all of these social aspects, trends, problems that, we had some nascent sense of, but really came to the fore with that particular incitement.
Yeah, I even think of it on a personal level. People get diagnosed with a really challenging disease or
Yeah.
illness or life circumstance, right? And many times it's in that moment that they begin to really have a revelation about what matters to them, what's important, how they want to live their lives differently, because the mortality or the finality or the nature of that revolution that's taking place in their minds allows them to kind of focus on what matters in a different way than maybe in the day to day where you can become desensitized. So I think it's a really interesting idea that hadn't happened on a societal level as you're describing. I think we see it often on an individual level where something almost apocalyptic within their individual lives is taking place that's leading them to discernment of a certain type. And indeed, I don't know if you feel this way, Lynn, some of the books, as I just think of them in the basic program, are written by people that are in some ways, in their own time going through some of that, and that's leading them to some of these observations on the human condition in ways that are quite prophetic or deep and meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, I think about, so someone defined reality as, what resists what you wish that it would be.
Right.
And so it does make sense to me that, and I think Fry, the literary critic, says that tragedy is the literary form most sort of associated with reality because it is through catastrophes and crises and so on that that you didn't want these things to happen, so they must be coming from some reality. At the same time, I think it's important to think of that reality that literature educates us to, um, as not just the catastrophe and the crisis, but also the light of judgment. And again, I know that I have a kind of Platonic streak here, but I don't think it need be conceived as sort of metaphysical necessarily. It's just the fact that when confronted with these crises, we find ourselves still still needing to and able to appeal to kinds of sense making and judgment, by which we can look at them.
We have time for one final question, and we have it from Anna. Don't you think that the tragic, rather than simply referring to an event, a more localized event, as you said, is really the underlying condition of human life, that which is beyond our control, or maybe even beyond our understanding?
I the as I start to get older, I think this more and more. I think, aging and death are just awful. They're tragic. And I think, not to just joke, but I think that generally there's a significant truth in what you say. I'm trying to think of whether um, there's a particular kind of event beyond our control or difficulty that tragedy treats as opposed to just the whole human condition. Um, and if I had to say, I think it would be something that in some way we is associated with um, the I don't know, the greatness of our humanity. I mean, the classic tragic hero is one who brings these things upon themselves through through an impulse to transgress. And there's something sometimes wonderful, awesome, Danos, for those of you who have done Antigone and talked about this wonderful word that means both awesome and terrible and is used in the Ode to Man in Antigone. It's like word Danos. So I think particularly there's this sense of tragedy of human beings who are just always driven to go beyond, and this calls down Nemesis, the kind of revenge of the universe for that transgression. But it seems very intrinsic to who we are.
Well, Lynn, this has been a really wonderful discussion. You can see the chat lighting up with the same message. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us. Thank you even more for being such an outstanding instructor at our school. And thank you all for joining us to talk about a great book by a great author who is a wonderful part of our community here at the Graham School. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we'll hope that people are interested in your book before an apocalypse brings it to their attention.
Yeah, thank
Thank,
you. There's a lot of like appreciation of great literature and literary language. It's
yes,
not all a downer. Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you everyone for coming, and hope to have the opportunity to talk with you virtually or in person about all these things.
thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Stay warm if that's relevant to where you are.